K2 signs. Your ego is winning, and what Epictetus would do. You think you've tamed your ego because you don't explode in anger, because you speak softly, because you don't boast. But what if your calm is just pride in disguise? What if silence isn't proof of peace, but a shield forged by fear of judgment? The ego is clever. It doesn't want to be seen. It wants to win. It doesn't crave growth. It craves preservation, not of truth, but of image. It thrives when you confuse stillness with superiority, when you wear humility like a costume, and when you defend your reputation with more devotion than your character. Most people will never know the moment their ego took the throne, because it didn't arrive with a scream, it arrived with a whisper, a justification, a subtle resistance to being wrong. That's how it begins. That's how it wins. But Epictetus lived for the opposite. He lost everything, his freedom, his comfort, even his health. But he saw clearly, if your mind is free, no one can enslave you. If your judgment is clean, no insult can stain you. And if your ego dissolves, you finally become who you were meant to be. So in this message, we'll confront 8 moments where ego hides in plain sight, but not just to expose them, to defeat them, with the clarity of a man who lived with nothing and needed nothing. Epictetus won the war we're still losing, the war within. And by the end of this video, if you're honest enough to see yourself in even one of these signs, something in you will shift. The ego will resist. That's how you'll know this matters. Now breathe deeply. Remove your armor. Let's begin. Type 1 to write the next topic, or type the changes you want. You defend your image more than your integrity, fully expanded to approximately 4,500 characters, with the same voice, tone, and immersive flow as the introduction. It's subtle at first. You feel a sting when someone corrects you, and your first instinct isn't to understand, it's to defend. You start justifying. You start explaining why they're wrong, or at least why you're not as wrong as it seemed. And in that moment, something quiet but dangerous happens. You abandon the truth to protect the version of yourself you hope they still believe in. You stop listening. You stop learning. And the ego smiles, because it knows it just won a small war in silence. When the ego is in control, it doesn't care if you grow. It cares if you look strong. It doesn't care if you're right. It cares if you appear right. And if you're not vigilant, you'll start shaping your words, your posture, your entire being around a single purpose: to keep the image intact. But that image is made of glass. It looks like strength, but it breaks under the weight of honesty. Epictetus taught something most people will never dare to live. He said, "Don't concern yourself with what others think of you. Concern yourself with what is true about you." That's a terrifying proposition for the modern mind, because it means you must be willing to be misunderstood. You must be willing to look wrong. You must be willing to let the mask fall, even when the world is watching. But that's exactly what frees you. You defend your image more than your integrity every time you apologize, only to soften the moment, but not because you mean it. Every time you correct someone's perception of you, but not their perception of what is right. Every time you shape your actions around being liked rather than being honest. And the more you do it, the more distant you become from the grounded center of your being, the part that doesn't flinch when attacked, doesn't distort under pressure, and doesn't need to be seen to be at peace. Epictetus didn't fear being judged because he judged himself first. Not with cruelty, but with clarity. He knew the truth doesn't need a defense team. It stands alone. And if you've lived rightly, you can be slandered, mocked, corrected, even humiliated, and still walk calmly through it all. Because you're not trying to win the argument. You're trying to win yourself back from the grip of pretense. The ego is obsessed with how things look. The Stoic is obsessed with how things are. That's the split. That's the moment of choice. Every interaction, every correction, every mistake is an invitation to decide, will you protect the shell, or will you guard the soul? Will you shape how others see you, or will you shape who you are? There's no shame in being wrong, but there's deep shame in pretending to be right when you know you're not, because then you've betrayed the only witness that matters, yourself. And you've trained the ego to rise, not fall. You've taught it that appearances are worth more than substance. It's hard. You'll want to speak. You'll want to explain. You'll want to make sure they know you're not weak, not foolish, not unaware. But silence often speaks more. Acceptance often teaches more. And restraint often proves more. The loudest victory isn't heard, it's felt. It's the calm that stays even after your reputation is bruised. It's the strength to say, "You might be right about me," and mean it. You'll know the ego is loosening its grip when you stop defending the image and start defending the truth. Not the convenient truth, the whole truth. Even when it casts you in an unflattering light, especially then, because there's a kind of power that lives in those who no longer need to appear anything. A power that comes from within. A power that doesn't collapse when someone misunderstands, doesn't tremble when accused, and doesn't flinch when corrected. That's the kind of power Epictetus lived with. That's the kind of power ego will never give you. And once you taste it, once you speak without needing to be right, once you're corrected and you feel gratitude instead of shame, once you lose the illusion and find the essence, then you've taken a step away from ego and a step toward freedom. You mistake control for strength. Control feels safe. That's why we chase it. That's why we plan obsessively, explain ourselves unnecessarily, manipulate gently, and cling to outcomes as if our identity depended on them, because deep down, we've equated strength with the ability to make things bend to our will. But that's the lie. Control is not strength. In fact, it's often the mask we wear to hide our deepest fears. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of being unprepared. Fear of being seen as weak. You think you're in control because you hold back your emotions, because you schedule every hour, because you anticipate every variable. But when the unexpected happens and everything slips out of your grasp, you're not calm. You panic. You rage. You crumble. That's not strength, that's dependency masquerading as order. Epictetus knew this trap. He taught that the only thing worth mastering is your own response, not the weather, not the economy, not other people's opinions, just your mind. Just your choices, just your internal dialogue, because that's the only battlefield where true power exists. Everywhere else, you're a visitor, never the ruler. The ego doesn't accept that. It wants to expand its empire. It wants control over people's tone of voice, their choices, their reactions. It wants everything to align with its expectations. And when it doesn't pause to reflect. It blames. It commands. It tightens its grip. That's not strength. That's desperation. Real strength is surrender without collapse. It's flexibility without fear. It's the ability to stand still in a storm, not because the storm obeys you, but because your mind does. And that kind of mastery is invisible. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to control the room to remain at peace within it. Look closely. Have you mistaken control for strength? When you interrupt others to steer the conversation, is it leadership or insecurity? When you micromanage every outcome, is it diligence or fear of being out of control? When someone doesn't act the way you expected and you feel the need to correct or punish them, is that justice? Or is that your ego recoiling from unpredictability? Epictetus said, "Make it your business to learn what you should avoid." And the greatest thing to avoid is the belief that you're safe only when you control. Because the more you try to control the external, the more you abandon the internal. And the moment your peace depends on circumstances obeying you, you've already lost it. The truth is, most of what happens in life is outside your command. People leave, things break, plans fail. And if your sense of strength is rooted in keeping those things intact, then you're not strong, you're fragile. Strength is the ability to remain undisturbed when your plans collapse, when your efforts are ignored, when your words are misunderstood, when your hopes are delayed. Control is not the goal. Clarity is. Discipline is. Reason is. Those things don't require perfect circumstances. They only require that you return to your principles when the world moves against you. You won't learn this in a moment of peace. You'll learn it the day everything goes wrong, when someone cancels, when something breaks, when you're overlooked, when someone you love disappoints you. That's when the ego demands to intervene, to grab the reins. That's when you'll feel the urge to fix, to manipulate, to tighten your grip. But that's also your invitation to pause, to observe, to breathe, to ask, Is this strength, or is this fear disguised as power? Because the stronger you get, the less you need to control. The more aligned you are, the less you're thrown by disarray. And when you reach that point, when the chaos around you no longer creates chaos within you, then you've touched something real. Not an illusion of strength, but its essence. Epictetus wasn't afraid of losing control because he never pretended he had it. What he possessed was greater. A mind that couldn't be shaken by external change, a will that didn't depend on obedience from others, and a soul that didn't need the world to agree with it in order to stay free. That's the kind of strength you're called to build. Not the strength to bend everything your way, but the strength to stay upright when nothing bends at all. You interrupt more than you reflect. There's a moment in every conversation where silence would teach more than speaking, but the ego rarely allows it, because silence makes room for uncertainty, for reflection, for the possibility that the other person may be right, or that you may need to change. So instead, you speak, you interrupt, you anticipate their thought and offer yours louder, faster, more confidently. Not because you're sure of the truth, but because the ego is terrified of being overpowered. Interrupting isn't always about volume. Sometimes it's mental. You stop listening halfway through someone's sentence because you're already preparing your reply. You nod not out of agreement, but as a cue for them to hurry so you can speak. You offer advice when none was asked for. You reframe what they're saying into something more palatable for your worldview, and you think you're engaging. But you're escaping the discomfort of full presence. Epictetus didn't argue, he questioned. He didn't shout. He listened. Not because he lacked conviction, but because he knew that truth didn't need to shout to be real. He believed that most people don't want the truth, they want to win. But the wise don't need to win, they need to understand. The urge to interrupt is the ego's attempt to stay in control of the narrative, to steer perception, to avoid vulnerability. Because if you let the other speak freely, if you truly absorb their words, you might be changed. And the ego doesn't want change, it wants certainty, even if that certainty is hollow. When you interrupt, ask yourself, what am I afraid will happen if I don't speak right now? Will I seem weak? Will I lose ground? Will they believe something false about me? Will they finish a thought that challenges my sense of self? Interrupting is rarely about the topic. It's about the identity being protected beneath it. There's a difference between having something to say and needing to say it. The ego needs, the Stoic chooses. Epictetus taught that we should discipline our speech because words carry weight. And silence, true silence, is not the absence of noise, it's the presence of attention. Every time you interrupt, you betray your own insecurity. Every time you hold back and listen fully, you grow in strength. Because you prove to yourself that your worth isn't tied to being heard at every moment, that you can let someone else take the space and you don't disappear. That your ideas can wait their turn without losing power. Interrupting is also a subtle form of violence. It breaks the flow of trust. It tells the other person, what you're saying is less important than what I've already decided to say. And over time, it builds walls instead of bridges. You might win the moment, but you lose the depth of the relationship. You might protect your view, but you lose your view of the other. The irony is that the strongest people in a room are often the quietest, not because they lack thoughts, but because they've mastered them. They don't need to fill every silence to feel valuable. They don't need to correct every error to feel intelligent. They let people finish. They let the room breathe. They trust that what needs to be said will find its moment. Epictetus never rushed to answer. He paused. He examined. He weighed. That's not slowness. That's precision. And it comes from a mind that isn't afraid of being changed. That's what makes it powerful. The next time you feel the impulse to speak quickly, to cut in, to correct, to elaborate, pause. Let the other person finish. Let their idea land. Let your ego feel the silence without panicking. And in that pause, ask yourself, what's more valuable right now, being heard or truly hearing? If you train yourself to reflect more than you interrupt, you'll start to see things you've been missing for years. You'll hear not just words, but fears, hopes, wounds behind those words. You'll learn to respond, not react, to build, not defend. And in that shift, the ego will begin to weaken. because it can't survive in a mind that's no longer afraid of quiet. True strength isn't in dominating the conversation. It's in mastering your inner noise enough to let others speak freely, and in doing so, you become someone worth listening to. You seek credit for invisible battles, written with the same voice and narrative clarity. You want them to notice the discipline behind your silence, the restraint behind your smile, the internal battles you fought alone in the dark, without applause, without recognition. And when they don't, something inside you stirs, a quiet bitterness, a subtle thought. They have no idea what I go through, and the ego sees its chance. It whispers that you deserve credit, that you've earned acknowledgement, that you should, at the very least, be seen. So you start dropping hints. A passing comment here, a humble brag there. You frame your sacrifices carefully, so they sound like offhand remarks. You reveal your good deeds just enough to seem modest. And all the while, your actions slowly shift, not toward excellence, but toward visibility. This is one of the ego's most seductive lies, that doing the right thing means less if no one notices, that virtue only matters if it's witnessed. But Epictetus taught the opposite. He said that true progress is invisible, that the only one who needs to know what you've conquered is you. Because if your peace is dependent on external validation, it will always be in someone else's hands. Every time you feel the need to be seen for your effort, your growth, your strength, it's worth asking, who is that need serving? Is it your character, or is it your ego craving applause for doing what should be done without reward? There is a quiet nobility in unrecognized effort, a sacredness in the unseen battle. When you choose patience over retaliation, no one may know what it cost you. When you get up early to train, to study, to improve, no one may ever praise your discipline. When you choose to forgive in silence, to let go without telling the story, to rise above without announcing it, there may be no applause. But that's the test. That's the proving ground of virtue. The ego wants currency. It wants its efforts cashed out in recognition. It wants someone to say, "You're amazing for enduring this." But virtue doesn't work like that. As soon as you act for the sake of being admired, you've changed the source of your strength. You're no longer growing for what is right. You're growing for what is noticed. Epictetus lived as a slave, crippled, poor, exiled, and yet his dignity was untouched. Not because others praised it, but because he knew it was his, unshakable, internal. That's the Stoic path. Not to be rewarded for your resilience, but to become someone who no longer requires a reward to be resilient. You seek credit because the ego wants to be paid for its suffering. But your suffering is your tuition. Your struggle is your sharpening. No one else owes you for it. And the moment you accept that, you reclaim power. You no longer wait for someone to clap for your silence. You don't need them to see it. You need to embody it. This is not about being invisible forever. It's about letting go of the need to be noticed in the moment, because often the more invisible the growth, the more real it is. External credit fades. Internal strength accumulates. There's a kind of person whose power is quiet. You feel it, but they never explain it. You sense their depth, but they never draw attention to it. They don't need you to see how far they've come, because they're not walking for you. They're walking for truth, for mastery, for the refinement of the soul. So if you've been fighting alone, good. That's where the real work happens. If you've been holding yourself together in silence, excellent. That's where the ego weakens. And if no one sees it, let that be your training. Let that be your fire. The less recognition you need, the more unshakable you become. When the moment of true testing comes, when life presses on you in public, what will emerge is what you built in private. And no amount of applause can fake that. No amount of recognition can substitute for the real thing. Do the work, carry the weight, walk the path. Let the world stay unaware. The soul doesn't need an audience. It needs discipline, and the less you seek credit, the more credit you build where it matters most, within. You confuse stubbornness with principle. You think you're being principled, unmoving, anchored in truth. But deep down, if you're honest, You're just unwilling to change. You've mistaken stubbornness for virtue, inflexibility for strength, and resistance for discipline. The ego doesn't care if the principle is true, it just doesn't want to lose, and it will call that pride conviction as long as you let it. You hold your ground, not because the ground is firm, but because you're afraid of how it will look if you backtrack. You cling to your words, not because they were wise, but because they were public. You defend your old beliefs, not because they still make sense, but because admitting otherwise would bruise the image you've built. And the ego loves this, because every time you defend something you no longer fully believe in, you surrender truth for consistency. And consistency in the hands of the ego becomes a prison. Epictetus warned of this trap. He said that progress requires admitting when your thoughts were misguided, that it's not shameful to evolve. It's shameful to stay small out of fear of appearing weak. But the modern mind is trained differently. We're taught to double down, to appear confident at all costs, to never show hesitation, even when we're unsure. But Stoic confidence isn't loud, it's humble. It says, I may have been wrong, and I'm strong enough to change. You'll know the ego is in control when correction feels like an attack, when new information feels like a threat. When someone challenges your idea, and instead of leaning in with curiosity, you armor up with defensiveness. And worst of all, you'll start creating mental narratives not to uncover truth, but to preserve your old stance. This is how people become ideologically rigid. They stop being seekers, they start being defenders. But what they're defending isn't virtue, it's their own pride. They become unwilling to admit that a better perspective exists. Not because it doesn't, but because it didn't come from them. True principle is rooted in alignment with reason, nature, and virtue. It grows when tested. It adjusts when clarity increases. It becomes sharper, not duller over time, but stubbornness refuses to be refined. It's built on fear, fear of looking weak, fear of seeming inconsistent, fear of having to rebuild one's internal structure. And so the ego resists change, even when change would mean liberation. You must ask yourself with brutal honesty, is this belief I'm defending really born of principle, or is it just mine? Did I choose it because it was right, or have I kept it because it's comfortable? Because it's become part of how I present myself, how I think others see me? Stoicism doesn't demand that you always be right. It demands that you always seek what is right. There's a difference. One is ego. The other is freedom. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is let go of a belief you've built your image around. Not because it was evil, not because it was foolish, but because it has outlived its truth. The sun doesn't cling to the night. The mind, when disciplined, doesn't cling to old frames out of habit. It shifts, it evolves, it sharpens itself against the grindstone of reason. The next time you catch yourself resisting an idea, not because it lacks merit, but because it didn't originate from you, pause. Ask yourself, if I had no history with this belief, would I still defend it? If no one knew I held this position, would I still fight for it? There's no shame in evolution. There's shame in self-betrayal. The world changes, new knowledge arrives, perspectives expand. And if you remain still while everything around you grows, you're not principled, you're frozen. Epictetus would rather be corrected than revered, because his identity wasn't built on being unmovable. It was built on being aligned. You can't build alignment on a foundation of resistance. You build it by letting reason lead, even if it pulls you away from what you once called home. Let go of the need to appear consistent. Let go of the fear of changing course. You don't owe your past beliefs your loyalty. You owe your soul its liberation. You avoid help to avoid humility. You say you've got it under control, that you're fine, that you're used to handling things alone. You call it independence. You call it self-reliance. But if you peel back the words, what you'll find isn't strength. It's fear. Fear of being seen as needing someone. Fear of being perceived as fragile. Fear that asking for help might puncture the image of competence you've spent so long polishing. And the ego feeds on that fear. It convinces you that to need is to be weak, that to lean is to collapse, and that to ask is to surrender. But Epictetus saw things differently. He taught that wisdom doesn't isolate, it connects. that the one who refuses help out of pride is not strong, but enslaved. Because if your sense of identity is so delicate that it can't survive the vulnerability of asking, then you're not standing tall, you're just hiding behind the illusion of resilience. There's a dangerous kind of solitude the ego calls nobility. It sounds like this: no one understands me, I don't want to burden others, I'll figure it out myself. And the world applauds it because it looks disciplined, it looks self-sufficient. But silence isn't always noble. Sometimes it's just avoidance in disguise. Avoidance of humility, avoidance of exposure, avoidance of surrendering the illusion that you're always composed. There's nothing stoic about pretending you're untouched by struggle. Stoicism isn't the suppression of need, it's the mastery of how you carry that need. It's knowing when to endure and when to open your hand. Even Marcus Aurelius, emperor of the most powerful empire in the world, wrote pages of self-instruction because he knew he needed guidance. Strength isn't built in isolation. It's refined in the friction of human connection. You avoid help because deep down, the ego tells you that being helped means being lesser, that if someone steps in to support you, they now have power over you, and that illusion turns every gesture of love into a threat. So you reject it. You minimize your struggle. You downplay your confusion. You nod and pretend to understand. You smile and say you're fine. Not because you are, but because you don't want to be seen. But what if being seen didn't destroy you? What if being helped wasn't a defeat, but a sign of clarity? What if the person who accepts help is not failing, but is simply honest enough to know when their own strength needs support? The ego confuses exposure with danger. But vulnerability, when embraced with awareness, is a tool of transformation. It softens what is rigid, it opens what is closed, and it connects what was isolated. You don't need to share everything with everyone, but when you pretend to need nothing from anyone, you build walls around your growth. You cut yourself off from wisdom, from learning, from honest conversation. You turn every opportunity for intimacy into a performance of independence. And slowly, without even realizing it, you become alone, not by choice but by habit. Epictetus wasn't ashamed of being a student. He sought teachers, questioned assumptions, invited challenge, not to prove himself, but to purify his mind, to see more clearly, to understand more deeply. That's not weakness. That's the highest form of strength. The next time you feel the urge to say, "I'm fine," when you're not, pause. Ask yourself, what am I afraid will happen if I tell the truth? Will they think less of me? Or am I the one still thinking less of myself for needing? There's immense power in saying, "I don't know. Can you help me understand?" Or, "I'm struggling. Can I share this with you?" Not because it solves everything, but because it breaks the ego's grip. And once you break that grip, you can begin to move forward, not alone, but with momentum. Don't let pride keep you in pain. Don't let the illusion of strength keep you from the path of actual strength. The one who knows when to reach out isn't lesser, they're wiser, because they understand something most people never will, that asking isn't a collapse, it's an awakening. You're more focused on looking calm than being calm. You keep your voice steady, your face still, your words measured. To anyone watching, you seem in control, stoic, composed, unbothered. But beneath that stillness, there's tension. Not peace, performance, not inner silence, strategic quiet. Because what you've built isn't calm, it's armor. A mask crafted to look like mastery, while underneath, your mind is racing, your emotions are suppressed, and your thoughts are biting their tongues just to maintain the illusion. This is the ego's quietest trick. It teaches you to value appearance over essence, to rehearse how calm should look, instead of doing the brutal, invisible work of actually becoming calm. So you master the expression. You practice neutrality. You speak like a monk, but your mind reacts like a child, and the more people believe your act, the more deeply you believe it too, until one day something unexpected pierces your shell, and the whole illusion cracks. Epictetus didn't chase the appearance of peace. He chased the truth that creates it. And that truth is often ugly, unflattering, chaotic. He didn't teach suppression. He taught discipline. And there's a difference. Suppression is pretending not to feel. Discipline is feeling fully and still choosing wisely. One is denial, the other is command. You may believe you're calm because you didn't raise your voice, because you walked away, because you didn't reply to that insult. But real calm isn't judged by your ability to hold back a reaction. It's judged by the absence of the need to react at all. Not because you forced yourself, but because the trigger lost its power. Because the storm passed through you and found no resistance to push against. Looking calm is about control. Being calm is about understanding. One is tense, the other is free. One is always at risk of being exposed. The other no longer fears exposure because it has nothing to hide. When you focus on looking calm, you become obsessed with perception. You check how your tone sounded. You analyze how they interpreted your silence. You walk away from a conversation and replay it, not to grow from it, but to grade your performance. That's not inner peace. That's ego in disguise, using the mask of stoicism to avoid vulnerability. And there's danger in that mask, because the more polished your image becomes, the harder it is to admit when your mind is chaotic. The harder it is to say, "That shook me," or "I'm not okay today," or "I felt anger and I didn't know what to do with it." So you don't admit it, you hide it. And it festers. There's no honor in pretending to be calm while quietly falling apart. Epictetus would call that fraud, because truth matters more than image, especially to yourself. The Stoic path isn't about appearing untouchable, it's about becoming unshaken, not through denial but through confrontation, through rigorous examination of your desires, your fears, your expectations. True calm comes not from trying to control the external world, but from surrendering your demand that it behave a certain way. You stop insisting that people act according to your script. You stop resenting events that don't unfold in your favor. And from that surrender, stillness grows, not as a pose, but as a natural consequence. So how do you know if your calm is real? Ask yourself how often you feel the need to prove it. Real calm doesn't explain itself. It doesn't post about its discipline. It doesn't correct others to signal its wisdom. It just is. It observes. It responds slowly. It listens deeply. And when it acts, it does so without inner noise. Ask yourself what happens when no one's watching. Are you still that composed, or is your performance built for the audience? There's nothing wrong with wanting to remain centered. But the path to that place requires honesty. You must allow your mind to be messy before it becomes clear. You must face the chaos directly, not cover it with silence, but understand its source and loosen its grip. The next time you're praised for being calm, don't take it as confirmation. Take it as a question. Ask yourself, was that peace or performance? Because one disappears the moment you're triggered, the other remains even when everything falls apart, and only one will set you free. You use stoicism as a shield, not a sword. You say you don't care, that nothing affects you anymore, that you've mastered detachment, that you've transcended emotion. You use words like resilience, logic, discipline, and you repeat phrases from the Stoics like mantras. You say them not to understand, but to defend, because what you've built isn't stoicism. It's armor. And what you call strength is often just numbness in disguise. There is a difference between being unmoved and being disconnected. One is power, the other is protection. And if you look closely, you'll see that you haven't become unshakable. You've just become unreachable. Not because you've grown past your emotions, but because you're now afraid of what they might reveal. This is the ego's final trick. When it can't win through pride, it wins through false humility. When it can't dominate, it disappears behind the veil of philosophy. It turns stoicism into a shield, not to face life, but to avoid it. But Epictetus didn't teach you to feel nothing. He taught you to feel honestly and act rationally, to face suffering, not to pretend it doesn't exist, to look at your grief, your fear, your anger, not with shame, but with courage, and in that confrontation, to choose virtue. That's the sword. That's the difference. When you use stoicism as a shield, you avoid vulnerability under the banner of logic. You mock others for reacting emotionally, not out of wisdom, but to reinforce the belief that you're above them. You suppress feelings, not because you've examined them, but because you're afraid of what will happen if you let them rise. You use indifference as insulation, not insight. You say you're stoic, but you flinch at intimacy. You withdraw from confrontation. You refuse to say that hurt. You mask your loneliness with talk of self-sufficiency, and behind all that control is someone who still bleeds, but pretends not to. True stoicism is not cold, it's clear. It doesn't avoid pain, it goes through it, with eyes open. With reason as a guide, with virtue as the compass. It doesn't deny humanity, it sharpens it. If you're hiding behind philosophy, you've misunderstood its purpose. Stoicism is not an escape from the world. It's a set of tools to live fully inside it, with strength, with depth, with presence. The world will hurt you. People will misunderstand you. Life will not bend to your will. Stoicism doesn't make you immune. It makes you ready. You don't need to quote Marcus Aurelius to prove you're composed. You don't need to recite Epictetus to show you're wise. Their words were not written to protect your image. They were written to free your soul. If you feel nothing, you're not alive. And if you feel everything but express nothing, you're not free. The path is not to shut down emotion. It's to examine it, challenge it, and direct it. Not to pretend you're above the chaos, but to move through it with dignity. You can't grow if you hide behind the idea that growth has already happened. You can't change if you believe you've already mastered yourself. The ego loves to wear stoicism like a mask. But the soul suffers beneath it, silently, endlessly. The sword of stoicism is sharp, but it's only useful if you wield it inward, against your illusions, against your attachments, against the part of you that wants to win instead of heal, that wants to look disciplined instead of become disciplined. Epictetus didn't ask you to escape life. He asked you to engage it with your eyes wide open, to stop blaming, to stop performing, to stop running, and to start choosing every moment, every day, not because you've numbed yourself, but because you've awakened to what matters. You don't need to feel nothing. You need to stop fearing what you feel. You don't need a shield. You need a reason. Now you see it, don't you? The ego wasn't loud. It didn't knock down your door. It slipped in through your strengths. It hid behind your calm. It whispered while you called it reason. It wore the robes of discipline. It spoke through the lines you thought were wisdom. And all the while, it convinced you it was virtue. You weren't losing to arrogance, you were losing to pride dressed as principle, to control mistaken for courage, to independence fueled by fear. And the worst part was, you looked strong. You looked centered. People respected your silence, admired your restraint, praised your logic. But inside, something wasn't at peace. Something was tightening, hardening, closing itself off. You were becoming untouched, but also untouched by the depth of living. Epictetus didn't live for appearances, he lived for truth, the kind that costs, the kind that exposes, the kind that strips away your justifications and leaves only what you actually are. Not what you project, not what others applaud, but what remains when there's nothing left to perform. And that's why ego is so dangerous, because it builds palaces inside your mind. Palaces that look like clarity, sound like wisdom, feel like strength, but collapse the moment truth walks in. It convinces you that letting go is weakness, that changing your mind is betrayal, that admitting you're still learning is defeat. But Epictetus knew the opposite. He knew that the one who seeks only to appear wise is still enslaved. But the one who can endure being seen as foolish while pursuing truth, that's the one who's free. You might have recognized parts of yourself in these signs. Maybe you've defended your image, clung to control, interrupted when you feared losing ground, wanted credit for your invisible efforts, confused stubbornness with virtue, avoided help to preserve pride, looked calm while burning inside, quoted philosophy while avoiding life. That's not failure. That's the beginning. The ego wants you to feel shame, to feel exposed, to feel attacked, so you'll retreat, so you'll rebuild the mask. But you're not here to retreat. You're here to confront, to strip away the false layers, to break the mirror and meet your own eyes again. Because once you stop pretending, you can begin practicing. Once you stop defending, you can start becoming. And once the ego falls silent, something else begins to speak. Not the world, not your image, but the deeper voice that's been buried beneath all the noise, the voice that says, I'm ready, I'm willing, I want to see clearly, even if it hurts, even if it means undoing everything I thought made me strong. That's the voice of freedom. That's the mind Epictetus trained for. That's the life you were meant to live, not one shielded from pain, but one unshaken by it. Not one praised for appearances, but one built on integrity. Not one admired by many, but one fully understood by the only witness that matters, you. Now choose. Not tomorrow. Not once you're more prepared. Right now. Choose to let go of the image. Choose to let the silence say more than your words ever could. Choose to be misunderstood, to be corrected, to be humbled, and in all of it to become solid where it matters most, within. If this message stirred something in you, sit with it. Let it sharpen your awareness. Let it guide your next decision. Not for applause, not for appearance, but for alignment. And if you feel called to keep walking this path, one of clarity, discipline, and inner command, subscribe. Not to follow, but to keep returning to what anchors you. And if a particular sign echoed in your experience, share it in the comments. Sometimes the moment we name what we've outgrown becomes the first moment we're truly free.